Here's a game for you. Everyone sits around a table and tries to figure out the most important events to shape Western culture. They probably haven't made that into a video game yet, but maybe somebody should. Because music is so much a part of life, it stands to reason that events, large and small, affect it. In Unit 1, we talked about the technology of the gramophone affecting music's most basic genre, the song. In this unit, let's continue talking about recent technology and its effects on music. Then, let's jump back into history to the mid-15th century and consider one of the most explosive of all technological inventions, the printing press. In addition to everything else, the new printing press played a critical role in a series of events called the Reformation, the split of Western Christianity into two parts. And the Reformation definitely had an effect on music. After that, we'll trudge forward and talk about selected big events in Western cultural history, focusing particularly on scientific achievements. We'll carry that right on up to 1914 and the outbreak of World War I, the endpoint in our course. That's plenty to cover, don't you think? So let's get started. I don't need to tell you that we're in the age of cyber music. I'm not sure what people will call this time period in the future, but the internet is changing music so rapidly it's hard to keep up with it. A friend of mine told me just the other day that her young piano students use their iPods so much that they relate more to the term track than they do to song. Do you still listen to the radio for your songs? If so, you're a person after my own heart. I love radio, but most young people no longer depend on a radio station to keep them abreast of popular music. Those days are rapidly ending. Yet, for the decades from the late 1920s until the 1990s, radio was the principal agent in spreading popular music. It determined what songs were hits and which ones fell off the charts. If a song were played often on the radio, people would rush to buy the record, and for many of those decades, they still bought sheet music to play and sing at the piano. In short, airtime on radio equaled sales dollars. And behind what we heard on the radio lay an elaborate commercial relationship between radio stations and record companies. That makes fascinating reading, as you can imagine. You can read about it in histories of pop music. The main thing is, I, as an average listener, didn't get to make choices. My only choices were whether or not to turn on the radio and what station to listen to. And then, after I heard a song, I could decide whether or not to buy it. Actually, I probably couldn't buy too many of them. Recordings were expensive. Every 45 I owned fit into this album I showed you, of which I was very proud. I played them until they literally wore out. But the internet has changed everything. Not only is every bit of music across the world available very cheaply, but people who want to hear specialized music are no longer left on the sidelines. If you like 1960s Peruvian jazz, you can find it on the internet. If you like string quartets written in the 1780s by composers other than Mozart and Haydn, you can find them on the internet. If you like bongo improvisations, you can find that too. And a lot of it is free. The internet is the great equalizer. The internet has been great for the classical music world too. Classical sales have risen as people gain access to music that would have been impossible to find in record stores or in printed catalogs just a few years ago. It was just this spring in 2009 that YouTube put together a symphony orchestra from auditions sent in through YouTube. The highly skilled YouTube audition winners were brought to New York City and gathered for a dream concert at Carnegie Hall. They got to meet top musicians and go to special places. It was fabulous. No one could have imagined this event 20 years ago. And best of all, lots of people who wouldn't otherwise go to Carnegie Hall were watching the YouTube Carnegie Hall Symphony Orchestra, and they liked it. On YouTube, the whole thing became cool. It's trendy, it's high-tech, and in this case, it has real musical substance to offer. Here's the thing. Historically, when people have access to something in the culture, they tend to take advantage of it. And that's the story of arguably the greatest piece of technology to hit the Western world, at least before the computer came along, the printing press. Maybe you have learned that the printing press was invented in Mainz, Germany around 1440. The man who gets credit was a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. Once he got his invention going, he printed beautiful copies of the Latin Bible with 42 lines of print per page. Even a single page from one of these Bibles is worth a lot of money today. The Chinese had actually discovered the idea of printing with movable type in the 11th century, using blocks of ceramic type with Chinese characters on them. They had printed books using wooden blocks in the 9th century and likely earlier than that. But for Western culture, Gutenberg was the guy. He fit little pieces of metal type with individual letters on them into a frame, locked the lines in place with a vise, slapped ink on them, and pressed them against paper. Thus, he could print pages with revolutionary speed, ease, and accuracy, and at a cost vastly lower than copying pages by hand in what is called manuscript, from the Latin for hand, manu, and scriptus, from the verb to write. Now, if you've ever watched someone set type into a printing press, you aren't going to call it fast or easy, but it's all relative, isn't it? You have to compare Gutenberg's process with the labor of scribes, many of them monks, who sat in dim light for 10 or 12 hours a day, copying documents using pen on parchment. By the way, as you may know, parchment means an animal skin, and initially the printing press was printing onto both parchment and paper, but parchment was expensive. An estimated 300 sheep were needed for each of the 35 parchment copies of Gutenberg's Bible. He also printed 135 on paper, which was edging out the much more expensive parchment. By one scholarly estimate, there were approximately 30,000 hand-copied books in Europe before Gutenberg. 50 years later, with as many as 1,700 printing presses up and running, more than 9 million books were circulating. And along with cheaper books came, by the 17th century, the spread of newspapers. We're living in a time when newspapers are losing their role in Western culture, particularly in the United States, where so many people have access to computers for their news. But until just recently, newspapers and magazines were the dominant way news and ideas spread throughout the society. You've probably studied the huge role played by newspapers in American history, so printing presses were very important. What about music? Was it printed too? Well, that's a good question. For centuries before Gutenberg's printing press, music had been hand-copied, written in manuscript. Carved wooden blocks had also been used for printing pages of music, but with limited success. So of course people wanted to use the printing press to reproduce music, but there were problems with doing this. Writing music down, called notation, requires very different symbols than words do. The history of notation is complicated. Manuscripts have survived from as early as the 9th century, showing symbols placed above words to indicate the melody patterns. Later, in the 11th century, notes were shaped as squares and placed on lines to indicate pitches. Next, ribbon-like slashes and diamond-shaped notes were added to the square notes. If you've ever heard Gregorian chant, that's the way a lot of it was written down. But there still was a big problem to solve. Nothing in the way the notes were drawn revealed how long or short the pitches should last. So next, the diamond-shaped notes became the shorter notes. Stems were added, and even flags placed to the right at the top of the stems. Then in the 15th century, hollow notes that began to look more like our notes today were being used. All of these advances in notation gave more information to the performer, but think of the difficulty of printing any of this notation. Think of the hundreds of little pieces, thin pieces of metal type lined up for making the long staff lines, little pieces of metal type for the note heads, and then other tiny pieces of type for the stems and the dots, and that doesn't even count the words that need to be printed. Well, it was impossible to print all of that in one sweep, so they ended up printing part of it in one impression, and then changing the metal pieces and printing more of it, careful to line it up, which was very hard to do, and then handwriting the rest of it in. Sound tedious? It was. Still, it was far faster and cheaper and more accurate than making multiple copies by hand. Yet, there had to be a better way, and there was. In the 16th century, the Italians in particular figured out something very cool. Publishers of music decided to use a technology that had been around for a while and used to great success by map makers: engraving. A skilled craftsman took a soft metal plate and some very sharp and sensitive tools and dug or tapped symbols into the plate, or, to use the right language, scored or engraved the plate. Engravers could score anything they wanted: lines, note shapes, stems, words, all of it was possible on a single plate. But get this, it had to be done backwards. Mistakes had to be hammered out on the reverse side and smoothed over. Then the plate would be inked and pressed onto paper. But as you can imagine, it took a lot of plates, especially for a longer work like an opera. The music on this engraved plate belongs to a trio from a 1775 comic opera by Joseph Haydn called The Chance Encounter. The music engraved here lasts only a few seconds. Think how many plates it would take to engrave the whole opera. Engraving really helped to build the music publishing business. A skilled engraver became a highly sought-after tradesman. Music engravers competed mightily against each other, and some cities became famous for their music engraving. Prices for printed music tumbled, and there was a lively competitive market in music publication. Later, an even cheaper method of printing was discovered: lithography, sometimes called the poor man's engraving, which used chemical etching rather than an engraver's knife. A lot of popular music was lithographed, especially in the United States. Lithography and engraving have been mostly replaced by computer technologies for printing today, although engraving is still done, especially for things like wedding invitations. But look, Henley Press, a fine German music publisher, still uses plates, like the one I showed you, to engrave its music. Still, it's rare to find this process in music publishing. If from the 17th century through the early 20th century, the music publishing business stayed so lively and profitable, what happened? The gramophone was the first culprit. The ease of hearing music by simply putting a needle down on a recorded surface ate away at the music publishing business. Before that, if you wanted to hear a song, someone had to sing it or play it, and that meant selling lots of sheet music. In fact, one of the greatest periods of selling sheet music happened right here in the United States. It's called Tin Pan Alley. Starting in the mid-1880s, the space between West 28th Street and 5th and 6th Avenues in New York City was filled up with music publishers. The sound of eager composers coming in day after day and plunking out their new songs in hopes of getting them published filled the air in that neighborhood. And with so many competing publishers and so many out-of-tune pianos enthusiastically played, the whole area resonated like the sound of rattling tin pans. Hence the name Tin Pan Alley. But this marvelous activity, which produced some of the greatest songs in America, ended up curtailed by the Great Depression in 1929. Not only did the bottom fall out of consumer markets, including sheet music purchases, but the instant gratification of the gramophone and the new invention called the radio were eclipsing the pleasure of sitting around the piano playing and singing music. And when people can have music without the hard work of learning to play and sing it for themselves, well, they stop studying how to play and sing. So, within a few decades, we went from a time when almost every child who could afford it took music lessons as a part of basic education to a time when it's more of a rarity. Well, that's a long stretch from Gutenberg's press to the 1930s, isn't it? But it helps us realize just how technology and the science behind it has affected music. There's another way we can talk about science and its influence on music. We can actually describe music using scientific language, since every sound we hear is an event ruled by the science of acoustics. Acoustics is defined as the science of sound and hearing. Every sound, from the clink of a spoon against a teacup, to the whoosh, whoosh of your dishwasher, to your puppy's bark, to the notes of a flute, breaks down into acoustics. Perhaps you've heard acoustical terms like pitch, vibration, cycle, sound waves, and resonance. Other acoustical terms may be unfamiliar, like amplitude, timbre, overtone, and hertz. Using science and math, we can analyze and explain every sound in our universe. Michael, you are a mathematician and a musician, so do you find that mathematics has a relationship to music?
Well, I think that music is primarily a form of mathematics, and they're both highly concerned with form and structure. Mathematics is also concerned with numbers, and music is concerned with numbers in the relationships of tones and the production of sound.
So is this a historic relationship? I mean, when you think about the history of both of these tremendous arts?
Yeah, music, as you've pointed out before, was worked out by the Pythagoreans and developing the sounds so that they could look at different sounds in relationship to each other. And this relationship was fully developed by the time music as we know it in the 1600s had evolved. The big problem was how many different sounds can you make at the same time that maintains interest and enthusiasm from the listener, and how well do you use sounds that move music in a particular direction, and why do you want it to move at all? Why not just leave one sound going on continuously?
That would be different, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think some of the 20th century composers have explored that immensely, which I'm sure you will talk about.
In the future, and that is one thing about 20th century music that our 16th century historical musicians, if they were to be reborn in the last 100 years, they'd be pretty surprised by some of the way mathematics has influenced music, huh?
Yes, very much so.
Music also involves what are called room acoustics, the science that explains how sound functions outside of a laboratory and within a given space. Acoustics were well understood in antiquity. In fact, modern acoustics was founded on the work of Pythagoreans in the 6th century BC and further developed by Aristotle and his students. Specific concepts of room acoustics were worked out as early as 1st century BC by Roman specialists in architecture. Medieval scientists worked out the problems of room acoustics in the building of the great cathedrals. They created big, complex earthen jars to be sound absorbers in the huge cavernous spaces, using meticulous science and mathematics to do so. Once we get into the 16th and 17th centuries and the building of ever grander organs in churches, then acoustical scientists had to tackle issues such as the reverberation time for sound. And later, as public theaters were built, scientists helped architects to use the right materials for the deflection and absorption of sound at just the right places. By the 18th century, some of the structures built inside theaters to create good sound were looking downright futuristic. And we haven't begun to discuss how acoustical science affects the construction and playing of instruments. People who play string and brass instruments have a particular affinity for acoustics, since they actually have to manipulate the laws of acoustics to create the sound coming from their instruments. Singers, too, are acutely conscious of acoustics because their whole body is a physical resonator for sound. Truth be told, every skilled musician must understand the science of acoustics. But what about general science? Has it affected music too? Absolutely. And to get a picture of this, let's turn to perhaps the greatest absolute monarch, a king with complete absolute power, the French Bourbon king, Louis XIV. In Unit 4, we're going to talk more about Louis XIV and his dazzling palace of Versailles and the artistic culture he built around it. But the beginning of his reign, from 1661 until his death in 1715, marked a time when there was almost no human endeavor that Louis XIV didn't make a mark on. Everything, from military tactics to education, and certainly the arts, fashion, design. He was in an ideal position to monitor even the explosion of the sciences in his day. For example, Louis XIV chose to link his identity politics, as we might call it today, to the sun. On one hand, because it invoked the Greek god of the sun, Apollo, but he was also keenly aware of the scientists who were developing a modern understanding of the solar system, an understanding that placed the sun at the center of the universe. The names of those making these astronomical discoveries read like a who's who in the history of science. People like Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei. These scientists had enormous impact, so let's say a word about them. The German Kepler, in his nearly 60 years of life, furthered the radical new idea of heliocentric cosmology, the planets revolving around the sun, developed a century earlier by Polish scientist Nicholas Copernicus. Kepler figured out the elliptical orbits of the planets and the relationship of the tides to the moon. Remember this business about the moon, because the moon will play a key role for us later in our discussion of 19th century Romanticism. About the same time as Kepler, the Italian Galileo Galilei was earning his reputation as father of modern astronomical observation. In 1610, Galileo used what was a crude telescope to see the mountainous surface of the moon, an amazing feat. Plus, he fashioned the first microscopes, just to name another accomplishment. By the way, Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a well-known musician in the 16th century, a lute player and a music theorist. Kepler and Galileo are so highly honored today that we forget their maverick status and the risks they took in presenting their ideas. In 1634, Galileo found himself under house arrest for his heretical publications. It took a century before he would be fully rehabilitated, when, in 1737, his remains were dug up from a side chapel and reburied in a place of honor at the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence. It wasn't just the circulation of the planets where discoveries were taking place. In 1628, William Harvey first put forth the theory that blood circulates in the body. This was radical information. People had to adjust their understanding of health to the new theories. It's hard to understand how such theories in science were controversial until we recall that certain issues today, for example, genetic alteration of food and cloning, are dividing our own society and threatening traditional values. I think when we think about this era in the past, sometimes we forget how exciting these discoveries were, both in astronomy and medicine, and certainly the developing ideas of tuning, for example, of instruments. But this was all news that was spread from mouth to mouth, village to village, but people were aware of the developments.
Right. The Pythagoreans had worked out most of the elementary structure of music, but like most things in mathematics, the structures don't occur overnight. They usually go through a long period in which they are debated, in which, I mean, some great fights have occurred over the centuries among mathematicians about what is mathematics and what is correct in mathematics. And the tuning, for instance, went through about a 2,000-year procedure before we got into the modern era. And this still causes problems, which you probably know as an orchestral performer, of playing on a piano, which is equal tempered, and then playing with a violin, which is playing on Pythagorean temperament, and the contradictions that occur between the two instruments.
There's a clash there, isn't there?
Oh, yes.
And it drives the violinist crazy to have to play with something that has fixed keys, yeah?
And most violinists I know hate to do that, but they adjust very well, and they realize that the piano isn't going to adjust.
No, it can't.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the mathematics on its side, does it?
And that was worked out, which probably was one of the turning events in the history of music, was the equal temperament developed in the early part of the 18th century.
Can you sort of explain what that means?
Yeah. In the Pythagoreans, they looked at lengths of strings.
Of a
string.
Yeah.
And Pythagoras discovered that if you cut a string in half and you activated it, it would give a sound which was very much like this original sound of the string. We now call it an octave higher. To the Pythagoreans, it was an octave lower because the string length was shorter. Mm-hmm. And then he discovered that if you take 2/3 of the string length and activate it, that it sounds very much in agreement with the original string length. And so by playing with 2/3 and taking 2/3 and 2/3 and so on like that, cutting strings up, they could generate sequences of notes. And then the history of music is more or less looking at when you come back almost onto yourself. When you start putting notes together, it becomes a lot more intriguing than what we think of as chant, where you have one note which is being performed at a given moment. When you start playing 2 and 3 notes together, then the 2 and 3 notes have to mold together in order to produce a sound which is nice to the ear.
Louis XIV embraced all of these new sciences. He couldn't have been more supportive. He established a Royal Academy of Sciences as quickly as he could in 1666. He set his best thinkers to work on mathematics, astronomy, anatomy, botany, and chemistry. He even had an astronomical observatory placed outside of Paris and built chemical and anatomical laboratories. Here was an all-powerful monarch, a progressive thinker, promoting discoveries that had just a bit earlier caused men like Kepler and Galileo to endure crippling persecution. And yet Louis XIV was also a very religious king, a devout monarch who supported the building and decoration of chapels and cathedrals and the promotion of beautiful church music by his leading composers. We get a sense of the dignity and elegance of sacred music during the Sun King's reign when we hear this setting of the Sanctus, usually called Holy, Holy, Holy in English, from a Mass by Marc-Antoine Charpentier. It was during Louis XIV's reign that the finest minds in Europe, particularly in France, put together an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. We'll say more about this later, but for now, know that the Enlightenment was characterized by a quest for knowledge and by the writing of great philosophical treatises and voluminous encyclopedias. In fact, the entire 18th century is often called the age of the encyclopedists. The momentum of scientific and philosophic inquiry in the 18th century led right up to the French Revolution in 1789, followed by the Napoleonic Wars. It's after these monumental events and throughout the 19th century that this ever-increasing focus on human knowledge and the dominance of science began seriously to challenge and even dismantle Judeo-Christian culture and traditional values. The cataclysmic nature of those years led to an explosion of emotional expression in the 19th century, and that was one of the most intense periods in all of Western culture, 19th century Romanticism. Values very much in conflict with Judeo-Christian values flourished during Romanticism. There was a throwing off of the moral authority of rulers and a rebellion against tradition and social order. New political ideas and a clamor for national identity were affecting nearly every city and hamlet. These resulted in great social and political progress in some cases, but there was also confusion, street riots, and political assassinations. And believe it or not, some composers were even on the front lines. On the other hand, creative individualism brought forth fantastic and gorgeous works of art and design. And all of the twists and turns of the 19th century led to the First World War, the crisis point in Western culture that we will use as the end of our course. 1914 marks the beginning of a war that changed the face of modern culture forever. We'll talk at the end of this course about specific reasons why World War I closed the door on past eras and opened up a new page in Western culture. Now, before I close this unit, I want to return to the time of Gutenberg's printing press and say a few words about the Reformation. A few words about the Reformation? That's like saying a few words about the Civil War or a few words about the Roman Empire. Still, from a musical standpoint, we should ask how the split of Western Christianity into Roman Catholics and Protestants affected music. That split is generally attributed to the bold actions of a brilliant German monk named Martin Luther, although discontent was brewing well before him. On October 31st, 1517, the day before the major Christian feast of All Saints' Day, Luther nailed a page of objections to specific church practices right onto a big wooden side door at the Cathedral of Wittenberg. It was posted there for all to read. That was not an acceptable way for a monk to call something into question by any stretch of the imagination. Things got worse for Luther, but he didn't back down. A line was drawn in the sand. A series of events caused him to be excommunicated, that is, denied communion within the church, and to be placed under arrest. But first they had to find him. At one point in 1521, he was whisked away by supporters to a German castle in the Thuringian Mountains called the Wartburg. There, Luther hid out and made a translation of the New Testament into German. This translation was enormously important. Remember, the scriptures were available in Greek, in Latin, but not in local languages. Of course, many people were illiterate, but other people able to read still couldn't read Latin or Greek, so they had to rely on someone else to read the Bible to them. A major tenet of the new Protestant branches was making the scriptures available, thus having no obstacle or institution standing between the individual believer and God's Word. That's why a German translation of the New Testament, and later of the Old Testament, was such a big deal. Quickly, other translations followed, and the new printing presses printed them all, spreading the ideas of the Reformation at lightning speed. Luther never intended to start a violent schism that stretched for a century, culminating in 3 decades of bloodshed called the 30 Years' War. But that's what happened. From 1618 to 1648, Europeans fought to settle which regions would stay Catholic and which would become Protestant. In exhaustion as the war took its toll, Northern Europeans ended up as Protestants and Southern Europeans remained Catholic, with the line going right through the region we call Germany today. That's why Austrians kept a Catholic culture while Norwegians became Protestants, or Lutherans, as Luther's followers were called. For music, the consequences were quite positive. The Protestants broke with a centuries-long tradition of basing church music on ancient melodies or chants, sometimes called Gregorian chants. Those chants were sung to Latin texts and had complex musical settings. They had an unmetered, fluid rhythm, which means they sort of floated along beautifully, rather than being music you could tap your feet to. The Protestants wanted their new church music to be simpler, more rhythmic, and more accessible, so they emphasized the singing of hymns to simple tunes, including folk tunes, with a robust beat, and they sang them in local languages, or the vernacular. German Protestants sang hymns in German. Dutch Protestants sang hymns in Dutch, and so forth. Martin Luther himself wrote German hymn texts to these tunes and composed some new hymn melodies as well. Luther's famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," called Ein feste Burg in German, became a rallying cry for Protestants and is still one of the most popular hymns ever written. Well, the traditional Catholic Church in Rome answered this musical development in its own way. During a series of meetings of the Council of Trent, starting in 1545, in what is usually called the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, Catholic leaders endorsed new kinds of church music too, including simple hymns in local languages, to be sung primarily at times other than the main worship service or Mass. They also instructed composers to simplify their compositions based on Latin chants, so that the words were clearer and the music was less intimidating. That was one of the many times in music where a style had become too complex, so it was time to simplify. Both the Catholics and the Protestants stoked the fires of change in church music, leading to good opportunities for composers on both sides. Ultimately, the German Protestant composers would take up a type of composition called a cantata, which has soloist, choir, and accompaniment. A cantata is a dramatic work that conveys a story or theme, but is not staged and not acted. Cantatas became the jewels of Protestant church music. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote more than 200 cantatas, and the many that survive form one of the most important bodies of choral music ever written. When we come to our discussion of Bach, we'll take up the topic of cantata again. Whether this history is new to you or not, I hope you are seeing why these events were so important, both in general history and for music history. That's why I've given you a handful of key dates to learn, really learn, and to know, so that you can see where we are in our narrative. The difference between memorizing a date and then likely forgetting it and learning it is huge. I suspect you know the difference too. But just in case, let me explain. Take something important in your life. Maybe it's the year you went on a big trip, or a sibling was born, or you moved. Or maybe it's something sad that happened, like the death of a grandparent. At any rate, unless you were very little at the time, you know absolutely when that thing happened. You didn't have to memorize that date. You simply know where it fit within the ongoing story of your life. That's the kind of knowing I want you to bring to these key dates, or try to bring at least. Make them real to you. I don't care how, use your imagination. You can make timelines or post them on your refrigerator. You can draw them on a t-shirt or make up a song about them. Just get them in your head in a way that allows you to know them, really to know them. Then, when we talk about something, you can think, aha, that was right after such and such, or that was about the same time as such and such. Okay? Good. Now get to work. And when you come to the next unit, get ready for a bunch of terms, a lot of them quite pretty, because they are in Italian.